gorgeous up there, I'm sure.
We got rained out. My check ride got rained out last week. Well, I'm not sure where two of our council members went, but we're going to go ahead and start the meeting. Welcome to the September 9th, 2013 Washougal City Council Workshop Agenda. Rose, could you call the roll, please?
Councilmember Boger, Councilmember Greenlee, Councilmember Plinsky,
Here.
Councilmember Shoemaker,
Here.
Councilmember Freeman,
Here.
Councilmember McDaniel,
Here.
Councilmember Lindsay,
Here.
Councilmember Boger,
Here.
Councilmember Greenlee.
I
Councilmember
thought you
Greenlee.
said Freeman, I'm sorry. I'm here.
Thank you. Are there any members of the public that would like to address council before we get started this evening? Larry.
My name is Larry Sari, 4019 A Loop. I'd like to talk about the consolidation merger and that I'm in favor of it. If you don't know me, I've had 33 years in the Washougal Fire Service, volunteer and paid, and back to volunteer again. And just a couple points. The study shows that this works. We've been working on this and it saves money in overtime. There's more savings that are available for this. We have better service to citizens. We have an ambulance in town. We have paramedics in town. If it doesn't go through and the ambulance goes back to Camas, we have that delayed response for the ambulance to help our citizens, which I'd hate to see that happen, and probably have some reduction in staff also. Like I said, 3 years, we have the union and the paid personnel have tried and worked together and trying to make this work and showing that it can work and that we can work together as a group. And I think that's been a positive thing, and you've seen those in some of the studies already that Paul Lewis has done. Gone through numerous committee meetings and discussions, and I think it's shown that there's more positive than negative on this whole process. I feel it's difficult as a department head to plan any short-term or long-term goals while this is in limbo. It kind of ties the chief's hands on trying to get some things completed or look to some of those goals and make us more efficient if need be. So I wish we could wish you could take a step forward and approve this consolidation merger in a short amount of time. Like I said, there's been a lot of talk about it, a lot of discussion about it. And I think the longer we delay, it's not beneficial or conducive to delaying it any longer than we have already, or postponing it. That's also showed that we are more efficient now than we were before and more effective to the citizens and staff. If you would like to have a one-on-one meeting with me and discuss different issues about it and kind of get a boots on the ground discussion of what I've experienced over the time and change, my email address is on the sign-in sheet, and I'd be very willing to sit down and talk with you anytime.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you.
Anyone else from the public that would like to address council? Marilyn.
I'm Marilyn Tyrrell at 950 G Street. Recently, I had occasion to look in the Post record and see about senior trips. I found one that was interesting to me, so I marked it, and then I folded it over, and so I couldn't see where it was really from. But anyway, I called the number, and the lady told me that the trip was all filled, but that since the city of Camas subsidized these trips, I would not be first in line should there be an opening. Well, the whole trip from here to Long Beach and back was $5. A similar trip with our group of seniors is close to $20. And I know that we don't have a lot of money running around, but this is about the time of year when you make budgets. And I would like you to find a few bucks to subsidize some of these trips, because some of them get canceled because the candidates cannot afford $17 or $20 for a trip, plus the cost of their lunch and admission fees should they be part of the deal. So I'm hoping you'll find some money for some of the trips anyway.
Thank you, Marilyn. Anyone else that would like to comment to council? Okay, that's your last opportunity. Going into new business, we've got some informational items tonight and some updates. Under administration, Washougal School District Turf Interlocal Agreement. David?
Thank you, Mayor and Council. As you know, as part of the 2013 budget, the Council appropriated $10,000 out of the PIF fund as a contribution to the turf replacement project for Fishbox Stadium. As you also probably know, that
I'm sorry, PIF means,
Park Impact Fee
thank you.
funds, thank you. That turf was installed recently, and there was a ribbon cutting for it, and the team played their first game on it Friday, and it must have been good luck for them because they won huge. So in order for us to finalize basically the payment over to the school district for the use of the PIF funds, there were two hurdles that we needed to accomplish in order to legitimately use those funds. The first is that that facility needs to be acknowledged in our parks plan, and the council did that in a recent update to the plan, so the facility's been acknowledged there and it's eligible for the funds. And then the other is that it has to have some public use component to it. Park Impact Fee funds are for the public's access to park facilities. So because we don't own that facility, we inquired of MRSC and with our attorney about what mechanisms we could put in place so that that would be legitimized, and they indicated that if the school district makes that facility available to the public, subject to restrictions, they can restrict public access, that we could enter into an agreement with them acknowledging how they do that for this modest sum that we're investing into the facility. And so we have an agreement that's in front of you, and in 2 weeks it'll be for your approval. The school board is reviewing this document, I believe, tomorrow at their meeting, and then in a couple of weeks it'll be on their agenda for approval as well. And as you'll read in the interlocal agreement, it makes certain recitals about the facility. It talks about the public access, and it very specifically points to a board policy and procedure that they have, which is how they provide for access. It prioritizes it to certain groups, and it provides for fees. And those restrictions are reasonable restrictions on public access, but there is public access, and many of our constituents use that field as parts of different things. So that's all in place. We have, as administrations, working with the school district administration, hammered out this arrangement, so it's for your consideration, and upon its approval, then we'll remit the funds to them. It's our understanding the life of the field is about 10 years. It was about a $500,000 field, so our $10,000 contribution is roughly a 2% stake in that, if you would. And so keep that in mind, you know, as you contemplate the use restrictions and the public access.
Where is the other money coming from?
I believe out of their general funds or their capital funds.
And fundraising.
Right. And they raised some funds, yeah. It's been bought and paid for. I don't know if they've made final payments, but they already budgeted for it, and they already procured and installed it. Yeah, it looks really nice.
Council questions?
That was the only thing that stood out to me as not an attorney is indemnification and hold harmless. And I would like to ask the city attorney whether he thinks that's adequate.
Don has reviewed this interlocal agreement.
I generally don't think they're worth the trouble of writing them. Anyway.
Any other questions? Okay. Moving along, Community Development Department, a development agreement between Killian's, the Port for Parker's Landing. Rich, good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Mayor, Council. Before you, this item will be on your consent agenda tonight to set the public hearing. Right now, we'd like to just kind of briefly go over it. Also here tonight is Dave Ripp with the Port of Kamas-Washougal, Executive Director, and then Lance Killian with Killian Pacific, representing Parker's Landing LLC, and Reed Stapleton with Berger ABAM as part of the applicant team. I'd like to just briefly identify the property that we're talking about here. It's all pretty familiar with the site of the former Hamilton Mill site, and there's a portion, Parker's Landing LLC has a portion of that property, and then the Port Kamas-Washougal has the other portion of said property. But the development agreement incorporates the entire properties, both of their ownerships for the subject site. A little bit of background here. Again, it's the former Hamilton Mill lumber site. There was a comp plan amendment and rezone that council approved in June 2011 to rezone the property, change comp plan designation, and rezone from heavy industrial to highway commercial. And then in March 2012, the city approved a resolution 1049, which was the development agreement at that time for the subject property that just vested the standards in place that we have had at the time. So that's all it did, was lock it into those standards when it was approved in 2012. What this proposed development agreement does, it amends and supersedes, so that's the first thing that you'll see on the top of the development agreement, amends and supersedes that original development agreement. It vests the standards and processes that we have in place. It vests capacity related to transportation and water. It also vests TIF rates and system development charges rates. It establishes, again, very specific design standards related to the uniqueness of this site. Those standards really built off of the commercial design standards and what we recently looked at with Steigerwald. It really builds off of all of those. And it establishes for us the certainty for the trail, the public trail and the park amenity within the area. I think that given all those things put together, that we will have a unique product down there that will look good for our city. At this time, I guess I'd like to ask whoever's going to go first. Is Dave going to go first?
Sure. Actually, I'm just setting this up. I will just put this up when I get ready to talk about this. I'll be Vanna. I'm David Ripp. I'm the Executive Director for the Port of Kamas-Washougal. This is a project that the Port has been on the Port's radar for quite some time. We were previously owners of the site and then leased it to the Hamilton brothers for their log mill site, and then eventually sold that property to them. Since I've been on the Port, coming up on 6 years, this property's always been of interest from our strategic planning process, that we wanted to have some type of vested interest in that property, because one of the goals that we had set was to eventually have a waterfront trail along our already owned, what we call our 6th Street property, and somehow tie that to our Marina Park and Historical Park. And by somehow getting a ownership in that property, we felt that we could have a trail that would go along the waterfront on the old Hamilton Mill site, heading east along our 6th Street property, and then eventually tying it back into our levee system at the Steamboat Landing. Thanks, Paul. Do the other one right here. So just a little bit of history. Back in 2000 and halfway through 2010, 2011, the Port embarked on an integrating planning grant that we received through Ecology. And the integrating planning grant is a two-structured grant where you look at contamination as well as planning. And we knew that there wasn't any interest in the property at that time, but we knew if we, and we couldn't afford to purchase it all at once, but being an economic developer, we felt that if we were able to get this grant and go through the process, maybe that would expedite a lot of the due diligence that needed to be done for the site, and also figure out where the contaminations, what contaminations were on the site, where they were located, but also on the planning side, looking at a higher and better use for that property, be it not a mill, some type of commercial development. So we had 2 planning sessions through our IPG, where we had public meetings where we took comments and input on visioning for the site. And not knowing exactly, based on this picture here, not knowing, we kind of did an artist rendition, but we knew the biggest thing that we heard from the public was we support commercial development on the waterfront, but we want public access. And it'd be nice to have a park. And so, and through our planning phases, and I'll kind of show it more detailed in the next one, but as you can see, the tip out, here's our marina, and then the tip, we show our waterfront trail on the water, and then coming out right at the end of our Florida existing 14-acre 6th Street property, and then eventually maybe moving forward, heading east to the levee. So stepping ahead, the port embarked on our trail project and also our cleanup. So right now, as of today, we are working on a recreational facility plan to lay out what we like to do on the recreational side of the port. But the big thing is for our trail. And by doing this rec plan, it'll allow us to go after some grant money through RCO to hopefully pay for a portion of the construction phase of the trail. On the cleanup aspect, we've currently signed an agreed order, accepted and signed off on a remedial action grant, and we're currently, the commission just approved a engineering and design work for the cleanup. That'll take place now, and then the actual cleanup will move forward in next summer's construction period, and we'll do the cleanup of that site. At the same time, 2014 is the time frame for grant proposals through the state. And if everything comes to fruition, we move forward to 2015 design. We're going to phase it. It just depends on the amount of grant money we get, but we'd like to see the trail done and a portion of the park, or kind of phase it how we're going to do either kayak launch ramp in here, or how we're still, this is, again, just a concept, so we're not into the completion of the exact engineered drawings for the trail, but we're trying to tie that in also with the cleanup. And so we can, some of the work that we do with the cleanup, with the moving of dirt and all that, we can tie in with the trail as part of our cleanup efforts. So as of today, again, we're just, we have one more open house, September 24th at the port, where we're looking at public comment and input on our trail system, as well as our rec plan, and we're updating the public on our cleanup efforts of the Hamilton site. Any questions? Okay.
Dave, can I just ask you one
Yes.
thing? Curious question. You owned the property, then you sold it, and then bought it back. Financially, did that work out?
I can't remember. They sold it in the early 70s.
Okay.
The story I've heard, the historical story I've heard, is that the Hamiltons had a lot of jobs. A lot of people worked there at the mill, and they were threatening the port if they didn't sell it, that they would pick up and leave. And I think the commissioners at that time thought, hey, these are a lot of good jobs. We don't want to lose them, and so we'll sell that. And we're excited because, ports are a good management of and good stewards of public properties, and I think by doing this trail, we're going to open up the access to the waterfront. We're going to have areas where people can walk down and touch and feel the water, and then also have other amenities on the upland parts of the property.
I'm very excited about the trail. Thank you.
Dave, also, you'll notice on this map how it's different than the map up on the screen. The development agreement that we're currently looking at is only the joint property that's owned. Yeah,
This part right here.
Right, and then the port will, it's already said they'll be back later with a development agreement very similar to probably the one we're looking at right now for the rest of the portion of property.
Thanks, Dave.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, Mayor and council members. My name's Lance Killian. I've met a few of you before, but I'm here on behalf of Killian Pacific, which was mentioned, but also Parker's Landing LLC, which is the actual ownership entity for the private portion of the project that Dave was referring to. I want to start by saying thank you to city staff. Mitch and Dave have been great to work with. We've worked in several jurisdictions and on a lot of DAs, and they've just been very collaborative and always protecting the city's interests, but trying to find solutions oriented as opposed to throwing up roadblocks. So I think it's important for you to know that because they've done a great job getting to this point. I also want to say, as it relates to the port, that process, our discussions and really a collaboration with the port started back in 2010 when we were able to go under contract on acquiring this property and work hand in hand through that IPG process. And we've had a lot of meetings and discussions about how we can make the most of what this opportunity presents for the community. And what we're here about tonight is just one of those steps in a multi-step process to make something reality on this property. We have a little bit of sentimental interest in what's happening here. I have, as parents, a paper maker and a panther. So we've already done a decent amount of commercial development in the city of Washougal, and we're pretty excited about what this opportunity presents and being a part of it. That said, beyond the personal side, as a company and a business, really our internal mantra as a company is enhancing community. And we see the whole reason we became interested and have made a significant investment in this property is that's the bullseye. This property is the bullseye of what we see to meet that sort of mantra. And we think this is an amazing opportunity for the community, and we're really excited to be a part of it. And appreciate your consideration of the development agreement. We've been involved in one other development agreement already in the city of Washougal prior to becoming involved in this property, and several others in other jurisdictions. And it's a really important tool, especially for a project of this size and likely duration from an absorption perspective, to have a framework, a stable framework and foundation to build off of. So we're really excited to take one step further down the road to trying to make something a reality here and enhance the community. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have as to the specifics of the development agreement or otherwise. So, thank you.
Council? Paul?
How large is the Parker's Landing LLC piece?
It's about 13 and a half acres. So all said, the former Hamilton Mill property is about 26 acres, and it comes to about here. And then I think the port owns additional property. The 6th Street property is referred to. It's 14 or 15 additional acres.
And just for comparison in size, how big is the was it Columbia House property? The
Grand Central Shopping Center?
Yeah, Grand Central.
That property is about 14 acres. There's about 200,000 square feet of building area on that piece of property.
As that? Going to be intense?
Potentially, yes.
When would we see what you plan on building?
Well, we have several steps sort of in the process till we get to that point, but yet to go. And a lot of that is driven by market, but will be driven by the market. So I couldn't give you an exact, we're highly motivated to make something happen sooner than later. We've made a significant financial investment in the property, so the longer we hold the property, from a financial perspective.
What are you talking about, a timeline? Like, when would you start and when would you finish?
I would say 2 to 5 years is kind of
Start 2 to 5 years?
Start in the next 2 to 5 years.
Okay.
Hopefully on the sooner rather than later end of that scale, but hedging my bets, just having come through what we did. recession-wise.
How long did it take you to build Grand Central? I mean, what was the timeline on that?
Grand Central, we built Grand Central in 2 phases, and that was over the last phase, which was really one outpad building, happened 4 years after the initial first phase. So it was less than 5 years total.
5 years for the whole complex.
Certainly, one thing to keep in mind is from a development perspective is the size of the market you're serving, and this is a big property for the size of the city of Washougal, just in terms of absorbing that much sort of development potential and opportunity. And so that's talking timeframes and timelines. If you hold the market static, that has some bearing on it also.
You did Grand Central in the middle of a recession.
We finished it at the beginning of a recession. Fortunately, it was the product that it was.
Given the proximity of an elevated highway overlooking this property, this is probably the most recognizable property in Washougal in a long time. It's a waterfront property. It's going to be noted by everybody that comes through town, particularly people who come from the west to the east, but also by people who come from the east to the west. You've got space for 230,000 feet of retail in there. Do you plan for that to be small establishments or a big box store? And I noticed the design standards are designed to provide flexibility to the developer. What do you have in mind there? Or is it too early to tell?
Well, just I'll give sort of an indirect answer because there's no cooked plan at this point in terms of what the size of the uses are and specifically what the uses are. But I can tell you for a project of that size and that much retail, to have success in terms of the retailers being successful, typically you need to have some sort of anchor or co-anchors that really can draw the people there that the smaller tenants usually are able to feed off of in terms of that demand. So I would say there probably will be an anchor or a couple of anchors or uses that make up sort of that anchor draw, and then there'll be smaller businesses and shops to supplement that. But as to what amount of the total square footage, I couldn't tell you here today. That's going to be more sort of market driven as we get further into it.
You've got a significant portion of this property that's going to be devoted to residential. What kinds of residences do you have in mind there?
So that's a very good point. I'm glad you're bringing that up because the development agreement that's in front of you isn't committing to a residential component. We believe, and I think it came somewhat through the IPG process, that there is an opportunity to do some residential as part of this larger master plan, and we think that makes sense with the right product at the right timing and the right place within the development in relationship to the rest of the uses. But the traffic study that we had done for the DA had to take a conceptual plan to generate trips, et cetera. And so not knowing exactly what that's going to look like, we had included in 200 housing units in the transportation study. But that doesn't mean at the end of the day that there will be 200 housing units. We're merely vesting enough trips to build out that much retail and that much housing.
Potentially.
So potentially, right.
Seems like a tremendous waste of waterfront property not to have some in there.
Paul?
Off the top of your head, do you have any idea how many trips a day Grand Central generates?
I don't have that on the top of my head. I can follow. I don't know. We haven't counted what it is now, but
right.
We certainly obviously did a traffic study that projected what those might be, and I certainly can pull that information and follow up with that.
Great, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Other questions from council?
Okay, so on consent tonight is,
Thank you, Lance.
on consent tonight is to agenda bill to set the public hearing for August 23rd, 7 p.m.
August 23rd?
September, sorry.
We want us to be summer for
Yeah.
There's plenty of notice.
Yeah.
And Dave, just to reiterate your cleanup process, you're basically looking at calendar year 14 to, between now and 14 to clean up, and
in the injury design phase.
and that takes basically everything off of there, all the asphalt, everything gets removed from there, and
We're trying to do some extra work in there as well, on bank stabilization, not just for our trail and stuff, so, yeah, the construction, actual dirt moving will start next year in July, August. Probably a less than 2 month process.
great. Thank you all. Next up, fire administration, fire consolidation updates.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. I switched seats so I could help with the PowerPoint here with Paul. We have several of us that will be sharing some information with you this evening. I'll introduce Paul since he's here, but you're all familiar with Paul Lewis. He'll have a good chunk of the presentation. We also have Dr. Whitwer here, who you've met in the past, and he'll be coming up after a bit. And then also the fire chief will have part of the presentation. As you know, you have tasked an ad hoc committee. Your public safety committee is serving as the members of a joint ad hoc committee with the city of Camas that has been exploring the full consolidation of our fire departments between the two cities, and has been looking at an interlocal agreement model that would provide for a contract for services between the two communities, and consummating the trial consolidation into a full consolidation. And we're at a stage in that process where it's really time to make sure we're on the right track and focused on what that outcome is going to be, because we're at the point to finalize a draft interlocal agreement and begin that effort in earnest. And so before the ad hoc committee takes that next step, we wanted to check in with you here at the Washougal Council, give you an update on where we're at in that, share a lot of information, and then also based on some conversations that we've had here with the council, provide information on different alternatives or scenarios that could be deployed so that you can see how the consolidation scenario lines up with other alternatives that are there. So we've done some alternatives analysis for you, and then we'll have some findings from those and some comments, and then we'll be looking for your comments and direction in terms of the next steps. And we'll, at the conclusion of the presentation, see if, from the staff side, see if any members of the ad hoc committee want to share anything about where that process has been. So our conversation will start with an overview of the alternatives so that we all have a mutual understanding of what the alternatives are that we looked at. I'll be going over that in part, and then I'll turn it over to Paul, and he's going to go over the consolidation, cost allocation, and share information about how costs were allocated for that, so that you have a basis of understanding for where those costs came, and then the work that he did for us in terms of cost assessment for all of the alternatives. We will invite the doctor up at that point to have some discussion about a regulatory process that would be entailed for one of the options, and then the chief is going to come and give some assessments about these options, and then we'll come back to the council. So we looked at 4 options. The first one goes without saying. It's the consolidation that we've been working on for quite some time, as you know. The next one, and the one to which the doctor will speak a little later, would be an option where the city of Washougal would stand alone for the entirety of this service portfolio with fire, EMS, and transport. And I'll just say now as a little headway to that coming later, this is not really a viable option. However, we analyzed it so that you could understand the costs that would be involved, and then the doctor can walk us through the sort of the reality check on the viability of it. And then there are 2 options we call separate fire with 3-party EMS, A and B. And as I turn it over to Paul, he'll help us understand the distinctions between the 2. But essentially it would be to go back to the way it was before we entered the trial consolidation with standalone fire departments and then the 3-party agreement for emergency medical services between the City of Camas, City of Washougal, and East County Fire and Rescue. A would keep an ambulance in Washougal, and B, there would not be an ambulance in Washougal, and you'll see the differences in the deployment and the differences in the costs. I do need to note that both of these last 2 options are options for the purpose of analysis. We haven't negotiated these particular options with the City of Camas. The administrations did talk briefly about their general parameters to make sure that we were kind of tracking with them so that the analytical model was based in reality in some sense. But it's important to point out that they're analytical models. They're not negotiated for sure opportunities that we would have. And I should mention as well in that context that the third one, the separate fire with 3-party EMS-A, would require some type of agreement with the bargaining units in both communities because of the way that we would be deployed. It'd be similar to what we're doing now with the MOUs that they've worked with us on to facilitate the trial consolidation. So those are the 4 options, and with that, I will turn it over to Paul.
Where are you going to go?
Or do you want me to go through? I can go through.
Is that you or me?
I'll do it. That's fine. I think you were thinking I was going to do it. So I will elaborate a little bit on these 4 options so you understand what the deployment is. The consolidation, I don't have slides for that. We don't have slides for that because it's what we're doing right now, fully consolidated fire department deployed as we're currently deployed. Current staffing levels and all of that. Some of the cost assumptions, though, will come out in more detail when Paul goes through that. But this one option, which is a hypothetical option where we would stand alone in terms of fire and EMS and transport, the deployment model that we use to cost this is what would be necessary for us individually to staff an ambulance in Washougal 24/7. So we would have 3 crews for a total of 6 firefighter paramedics. You're required to have some oversight over that program, so there's a captain. There's billing and other administrative support that would come with that program, and so there's a half-time support person, and then as you can imagine, there's additional operating expenses that would accompany something like that.
Excuse me, David, do we have the costs of each of these other ideas? I mean, what each one cost in comparison?
Yes, well, Paul's work was to do a cost comparison. Right.
Thank you.
Right now, we're just explaining what the models are so you understand the basis for what we costed. In addition, for this model, there are some one-time expenses that would be associated with starting up an ambulance service, as you can imagine, and those are listed for you there. And there's an estimate of about $320,000 a year in ambulance revenues that come from billing to users of the system. And that currently is revenue that goes to Camas. They do provide the service and do the billing. The separate fire with 3-party EMS agreement, the A version of this, we would retain completely separate fire departments, but we would maintain a joint ambulance through our 3-party agreement. It would continue to be deployed here in Washougal. And as has been the assumption through all of these conversations, including our long-range budget forecasting, there is an assumption about the levy rate that would be applied to the program at 46 cents per thousand coming up. The B version of this option, again, we'd have separate fire departments. We would have a joint ambulance per the three-party agreement, but for the purposes of comparison, there would be no ambulance deployed in Washougal. We would no longer need that 10th firefighter IV tech position, and so we would eliminate that position. As you'll recall, that position was created back when we started the trial consolidation to facilitate the trial consolidation. And so in the A version, that position would stay, and that's what makes it work in terms of deploying the ambulance in Washougal. If it's not deployed in Washougal, we would not need that position, but the payment arrangement would stay the same. So really the difference between the A and the B is where is the ambulance, or where is it not? And our staffing deployment at the Washougal station would be back to what it was before the trial consolidation. And so with that, I will turn it to Paul.
Thanks, David. As David mentioned, I'm going to cover two pieces. One is the allocation model that we use to allocate the costs under a consolidation example. And that really is based on work we did with the ad hoc committee. There was some staff work ahead of time, but we reported out to the ad hoc committee, and they saw that and blessed that allocation formula. And then the second piece of work is looking at the alternatives that David just went through and give you a sense of what the different costs would be for those four different alternatives. So first up on the consolidation cost allocation, one of the things we had to do is set some assumptions on both the revenue and the expense side about how we were going to treat the revenues and the expenses and what assumptions we were going to make. So first up here are the revenue assumptions. First is that general fund support would continue, so that's essentially your baseline fire department expenses that are exclusive of the EMS revenue that you have, but they are inclusive of your former lid lift revenues. So we took all the general fund support that you have for your fire department and extended that through. And these are 2015 numbers, so we extended these costs out to 2015 to have essentially a state, an environment where all of the sort of unique aspects of the period that we're in now were past us, and we'd have a set of assumptions that we could make that were fairly stable going forward. So that's why we moved it forward to 2015. To do that, we had to project the assessed value, AV, for 2014 and 2015 to properly project the EMS revenues that would be available. Ambulance fee revenue, we estimated this using the 2013 year-to-date information that we were able to obtain, and just to note that that was below the 2013 budgeted amounts for that revenue source. We included fire impact fees for both jurisdictions, and then also, as David mentioned, we assumed that the increase in the EMS funding from both East County Fire and Rescue and Washougal would occur in 2015. Okay? On the expense side, there are currently 3 SAFER funded positions, 1.5 FTEs in Camas Fire, 1.5 FTEs in the EMS service. We assumed that those would not be filled when the grant funding expires. We assumed that the salaries would be equalized. There's roughly $63,000 of difference in terms of salaries, both at the captain and the firefighter levels. So we assumed that those would be equalized. Equipment replacement funding, funded that at $100,000 a year. That's to replace the ambulances and also put money aside to replace fire apparatus. And then there's additional support services that could apply if they were all in a separate fund in Camas. You're familiar with how indirect charges are applied. You currently pay indirect charges in the current EMS fund. If you expanded that to include both the fire and the EMS, there would likely be additional indirect charges. We assumed that they would not be charged because they would just be covering existing costs, or that they would be handled separately via the 2 jurisdictions. Okay, so we essentially remove those additional indirect costs from the analysis. Okay. In terms of the allocation model, we spend a lot of time looking at a variety of other agreements that other jurisdictions are using to allocate costs in similar capacities. We looked at, I think, a total of 13 different agreements, and they all used one or more factors, including assessed value, population, calls for service. Some actually used where the station was located to allocate costs between the parties that were included in that agreement. And we assessed those different alternatives based on a couple of different criteria. One was making sure that it was justifiable based on the services and the deployment specific to your situation with Camas and Washougal. We wanted to make sure that it wasn't an outlier in terms of the other agreements that we were looking at. And probably most importantly, we wanted to see if we could come up with an allocation that really didn't create significant winners and losers. If you recall the discussion about the Regional Fire Authority, because you were forced into an assessed value-based methodology primarily for that fundraising, the discrepancies between the jurisdictions made it difficult for you to overcome the winners and losers that would happen as a result of using that funding model. So we were looking for an allocation methodology that would not create any significant differences in the cost that you're currently incurring. Okay? Like I said, we looked at 13 different agreements. Based on that analysis and the criteria that I just went over, we came up with an allocation recommendation that used 3 factors. 50% of the cost would be allocated based on structure assessed value. And this is different than total assessed value in that it takes out land, and it takes out personal property, and it takes out utility property. So there's certain elements. This is by far the biggest element, but it really is the structures that are being protected by the service that you're deploying. And this is, again, for the sort of fire protection component.
Do you have any idea how much difference it would be if it was just based upon pure assessed value?
I've got those numbers, but I don't have them handy. I don't have the differences handy. 25% of the allocation was based on population, and this is, again, justified by the protection component for both fire and EMS. And then 25% allocated based on total calls for service. And this is more of a demand component, so it's reflective of who's using the service that's being delivered. Okay? So when you look at these factors and come up with the weighted allocation, this is a little bit hard to see because of the small print, but the top line is the weighted allocation. When you apply the 50% to structure assessed value, the 25% to population, and the 25% to calls for service, you end up with a weighted allocation of 37% for Washougal and 62.7% for Camas. And you can see the differences in the proportions between the two cities in each of these factors. Calls for service, much more equally weighted between the two at 54% roughly for Camas, 46% Washougal. Structure assessed value, much more dominated by Camas at almost 70% versus 30% for Washougal. Okay? But the weighted factors take all 3 of those into account and get you to a 63-37 allocation. Okay? So we applied that allocation to all the costs and the services on a combined basis, less any dedicated revenue. Okay, so it's what's left over after all of the revenue that's currently dedicated for that service. But we assumed that the EMS revenue would go to the cities. It wouldn't necessarily go directly to the joint consolidated department. And the cities could use that revenue to pay whatever expenses that they were asked to pay. Okay? But there is some dedicated revenue, and that would include the ambulance fees, the payment from East County Fire and Rescue, the fire impact fees, and any other miscellaneous revenue that the fire and EMS service collects. And again, the cities would keep their own EMS revenue, but they'd use that revenue to help pay the allocated costs. Okay? So this is the result after applying the allocation formula to those net costs. And there's 2 bars for each city here. the blue bar on the left is their baseline funding. So if we projected out a steady state through 2015, this is the estimate that we have for their net costs. 4.4 million for Camas, just over 2.6 million for Washougal. We run through the analysis with the allocation factors, taking those net costs and apply that weighted formula, and you get roughly the exact same cost, just under 4.4 million for Camas and just over 2.6 million for Washougal. Okay? So this works out to be less than 0.5% difference compared to the current costs that you're facing. And this is, again, projecting out to 2015. Okay? A couple of qualifications with any kind of financial analysis or projection. This projects 2015 net costs using 2012 data. In real time, you'd probably be either using this year's data to allocate next year's costs, or you'd do it retroactively. So you'd have a bill that come and you'd allocate it based on more current information. So in this instance, we're using 2012 data with 2015 estimated costs. So there's going to be some discrepancies there. The Washougal baseline assumptions assume that the LIDLIF funding that you're currently using is replaced and that there's an additional 11 cents per thousand assessed value available for the ambulance and fire and EMS services. It assumes that East County Fire and Rescue also increases their contribution, and again, the lower assumption on the ambulance revenues, which actually works out to be roughly 2012 levels for the ambulance revenue. Okay? This is the last slide on the allocation formula that we went through with the ad hoc committee. Any questions before I turn to the alternative cost assessment? Again, we went through this analysis, came up with roughly a 63-37 split on the allocated costs, and it turns out that it's very closely aligned to what the current costs are projected to 2015. Okay. In terms of the alternative cost assessment, again, we're using the 4 alternatives that David identified: consolidation, Washougal providing fire, EMS, and transport, and separate fire, A with an ambulance in Washougal, B without an ambulance in Washougal. And again, we had to make some assumptions in terms of both the revenue and the expense side. The assumptions on the expense side were similar to what we used before. We took those same cost estimates that we had and used them to forecast cost estimates for each of these alternatives through to 2015. Again, using the 2014 EMS levy estimate and projected through to 2015. The additional 11 cents was there as well. And we used ambulance replacement expenses in all of these models. Okay? So we had $100,000, if you recall, for the consolidation estimate. We ended up replacing one ambulance at roughly $33,300 a year, setting that aside each year for each of the other 2 examples that had an ambulance. Okay? And here's the results. Not sure what that is down at the bottom.
Check mark, sort of.
Check mark, sort of. This shows you the results of the financial analysis. I'll go through each of these columns in somewhat detail, but essentially the first line are the expenses, the second line are the dedicated revenue, the third line, net expenses, shows you really the net cost comparison for each of these, and then we also show the difference. So the consolidation is that $2,611,000 that I showed you earlier, right, in terms of the 63-37% split. That's your share. That would be the bill that you would get. You would have $637,000 of EMS revenue available to pay that bill. So your net cost would be the $1,974,000, and you would have an ambulance in Washougal under that scenario. Okay? Under your own fire, EMS, and transport, the next column over, your total expenses would be just under $3 million. And this is a combination of things. You asked the question about what costs. Roughly $1,050,000 of additional costs related to the additional personnel, so that's 7.5 FTEs plus the operating costs associated with the ambulance. But you wouldn't have to pay Camas anymore. So there's roughly $588,000 that you would not have to pay to Camas. And you also would not have the 7th IV tech, so that'd be an additional roughly $98,000. And then on top of that, so that relates to the $2,997,000. And then you'll see that the revenue is higher than the consolidation, because now you would be also receiving the roughly $320,000 of ambulance fee revenue in order to offset that. So you'd have your EMS revenue and your ambulance revenue to offset that. So the net cost would be just over $2 million, or roughly $46,000 higher than under consolidation. Okay? Then we've got the two three-party EMS agreements, separate fire, three-party EMS, A and B, and as David mentioned, A is with an ambulance in Washougal and the IV tech, the additional staff person, and B is without both of those. And you can see the net expenses under the scenario that has the ambulance in Washougal is $1,979,000, really just roughly equal to the consolidation number. And then the EMSB results in lower cost because you have that lower staff responsibility, and you have slightly lower costs because of the both the ambulance replacement and that staff person. Okay, so it's cheaper, but you do no longer have that service of having an ambulance in Washougal. A couple of other things to consider. One, David's going to, I think, get into this a little bit more later, but there have been some estimated overtime savings this year, some of which is believed to be attributed to the consolidation. It also excludes the one-time ambulance startup costs. These, I think, come in a couple of different forms. You'll have a reserve ambulance that you'll have to keep, and then you'll also have startup costs where you'll have to hire people before you actually deploy the service. So there'll be some expenses just in terms of hiring, training, and getting that service ready. My guess is in the $100,000 range total for those costs. One other caveat that I'll add is that we used the 2013 budget for our projections, and I believe that your 2014 budget is going to come in fairly close to your 2013 budget. Won't necessarily be as high as what we've projected here. So we may be a little bit high in terms of our cost estimates here. Okay? So again, the takeaway here is that the consolidation is the lowest cost option in terms of keeping an ambulance in Washougal, but the cost differences really, especially with the three-party EMSA, are within that margin of error in terms of the estimate. Okay. Closing with a couple of quick observations. One is that consolidation and separate fire have separate fire A with the ambulance in Washougal have really similar costs. Both have a deployment of an ambulance in Washougal. I want to note that consolidation is likely to have greater potential for lower future costs, and I think the chiefs will get into this at some point, but we mentioned overtime management, training, staffing levels, equipment replacement, capital facilities, which is one that we talked about a lot at both the staff level and at the ad hoc committee. At some point, you'll have to replace both fire apparatus and potentially add a new station to serve your populations, and that could result in fewer physical stations being deployed, and those require staffing as well. Okay. The transport alternative, where you actually provide that transport service, is slightly more expensive, has those transition costs. One other thing to note is that the way that dispatch is handled, it may involve service to East County Fire and Rescue territory because of the closest unit dispatch response requirement. Okay? So there may be some additional services other than just to the calls that you would respond to from Washougal residents that you'd be involved in. Separate Fire Department B, this is the one without the deployment of an ambulance in Washougal, has lower costs, but also comes with it lower service levels. Okay? So those are the remarks that I had on the alternative cost assessment. Any questions before I give way to Doctor? Great.
Thank you.
You want to join me up here, Doctor, please? I'll introduce again to you, Council, Dr. Lynn Whitwer, who is the Medical Program Director for Clark County. He's an appointee by the Secretary of Health, State Department of Health. And I'm going to come off of the presentation and move to another document that the doctor provided. And before I do that, just a couple introductory comments. The statutory framework in Washington gives the legislative authority to cities to establish transport service. We are an entity that can provide that service. However, it is not an unbridled authority that we have been granted. You have to be licensed to do that by the Secretary of Health through the Department of Health. And it is a heavily regulated process, and the key component that the doctor will get into is this notion that through a very complex systems approach at the state level, down to regions, down to local councils, there are minimum and maximum numbers of licensed ambulance services that are provided at a county level. There are 4 of those provided for Clark County, and there are currently 4 held in Clark County. So there is not one available to us. Now, there is a process, and this is what the doctor will get into, there is a process to seek an increase in the maximum number. And if that was successful, and that is a big if, as we will hear, it's not necessarily ours as well. There's a market type approach that is deployed there.
Could I ask a question before we get started? Did Washougal ever have transport service? No. Okay.
I am going to pull up.
At least in my tenure here in Clark County, and I've been affiliated with the EMS system since '78. So I think, to my recollection, no.
This is in your Dropbox, and I think I did disconnect it.
Let's try it at the other end.
There we go. There we go. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I will turn it over to the doctor,
Okay.
and he can talk about this
Actually,
process.
I think you explained the background is probably better than I would have, but I just want to make sure that everybody understands that the ability for you to be in the transport business is actually not that easily given. The state has the right, and not the right, the state has the responsibility and grants all licenses for ambulances in the state of Washington. They also, there's a secondary issue here, which is they also grant licenses and verify trauma-capable services. And to be in the 911 system in the state of Washington, to respond to a 911 call, you have to be a licensed and verified trauma service, either in the ALS capacity as a ALS ambulance capacity, or as a ALS non-transport, an aid service basically, or as a BLS ambulance or a BLS transport, or non-transport, or aid service. Now, basically, Washougal Fire has been, in the past, a verified aid service, non-transport aid service. Camas is an ALS transport ambulance service, verified, trauma verified in the state. The state of Washington has 8 regions. There are 6 counties in the southwest region, including Clark County, Cowlitz County, Skamania, Klickitat, Wahkiakum, and South Pacific County. The state, each region has a regional EMS council. It's made up of representatives from each of the 6 in our area, each of the 6 counties. Clark County has its own EMS council, which has representatives on the Southwest Region EMS Council. The state, back when they established the EMS and trauma system in its most recent iteration, so 1987, and then again redone in 1997, gave to the regions the responsibility to determine minimum and maximum numbers of trauma-verified aid and ambulances in their respective regions. That then is further culled down to what happens is that the county councils recommend those numbers to the region analyzes it, and then the min-max numbers of aid services, trauma-verified, BLS, trauma-verified, ILS, which is intermediate life support, and then ALS, ambulance, transport capable vehicle, or not vehicles, but agencies is established. Now, very important to say that it's not the number of ambulances, it's the number of agencies that is designated as under the min-max. For example, in Clark County, we have 4 ALS. Our maximum number determined several years ago of ALS transport ambulances is 4. ALS transport agencies. Camas has 3 ambulances, perhaps 4 ambulances now. Makes no difference. They're one agency. They have one agency license. AMR has 25 ambulances in Clark County, but they only have one. They fill up one of the max spots. North Country has 4 ambulances. They fill up one spot. It has nothing to do with the number of ambulances. It's each agency that has a spot, and the other one is taken up by Clark County Fire and Rescue. But to make it really simple, Clark County has established that we have 4, that our maximum number of allowable ambulance services is 4 at this point in time. There's a whole bunch of BLS, but they're not transport. We have no BLS transport in the county, except in the case of, mass emergencies, mass casualty kind of things. Now, there's a process set up, and you're probably thinking, well, how can we change that? How can you get more ambulance services than, how can you exceed the max? There's a process, and that's the process that's put up here. And the process, basically, to make it simple, is that if a community wants to have more, or thinks they need more ambulance service, they go first to the local council, local EMS council, and present their case. And to make it easier, the state has established the guidelines for how you would go about doing that, and what would constitute saying we need another service. First of all, one of the bottom lines is that they say this developing or changing the min-max numbers is an evidence-based collaborative effort. Collaboration between pre-hospital EMS providers in a county, as well as between local and regional EMS and trauma councils, is a necessary part. Evaluating a community's pre-hospital EMS resource needs must be based on objective criteria, including, but not limited to, the demand for pre-hospital EMS resources. Has demand increased to a level where additional resources are necessary? Population. Has the population numbers changed, increased or decreased, or are there projections for a large population change that may impact need for EMS resources? Increased trauma responses. Have you had more emergencies involving severely traumatized persons? Available pre-hospital EMS resources. Has the number of available pre-hospital resources changed? Response time. Does the system quality improvement evaluation suggest that the response time for pre-hospital EMS resources has increased? In other words, is there a public need for another service? So the first step in the process would be to convince the local EMS council that you need to have another EMS, another ambulance service. They would require that you bring in all this kind of information. Yes, our population is not being served, it's taking too long to get an ambulance there, it's costing way too much for the individual ambulance ride, our trauma patients are dying on the scene because nobody gets to them in time. Barring that, they would probably say, well, does the medical program director of the county recommend that we have another thing? And I would have to be frank and say, no. I only recommend to the state these things. I don't make the rules. So you would first have to convince the EMS council that they would carry this forward to the regional EMS council, where the same process would go over. Because the regional EMS council is much more under pressure from the state to make sure, I mean, one of the state's basic overall things is that you need a minimum amount of ambulance there to provide for public safety, but if you have more than you need, there's redundant services which are often more expensive and actually ends up with complications. We had that problem in EMS District 2, the part of, the vast majority of Clark County 15 years ago was a total morass of multiple EMS providers trying to vie for the same ambulance patient. That doesn't work. It's expensive and it's a bad thing. So the state has some interest in the max number, that being efficient. If for some reason, some way, they were able to convince the Southwest Region Council to take this forward to the state, then it goes to what used to be called the Governor's Steering Committee, but now it's the Steering Committee on EMS and Trauma, on which I happen to sit as well, and you'd have to present the case there that they would need another ambulance service in Clark County. Bottom line, when David and I were first talking about this, and I was outlining this to him, how this happened, how this process goes on, I described, I think I made some referral to Snowball's chances in various warm places, but it would be a process at the very best several years in going, and probably not in my lifetime, to be honest, because we can't fit the basic rules for demand. Then, as I explained to David, if for some reason the state were to say magically, yes, we can have another ALS ambulance system in Clark County, that goes to a market-driven, open process, and anybody can bid on that to get that one spot back. Because, and I can tell you already that there are several private companies would probably like to snap up another spot here in Clark County. Because Clark County, most of Clark County is a franchise system, and they have to go wait for bid time to do that. So, the odds are, even if we got an approval for another thing, it probably wouldn't happen. I mean, it's 50-50 chance there. We're looking at a very long process, and I think the thing that you get to the state, you know, your joint councils and cities have already done what the state really recommends you do first, and they say collaboration, putting things together for the greater good. You do a better job, and you even have patches now that say Camas Washougal. So it's I think economically it's been shown that it would be good, and that would be the other thing. And they could say how the state would say, how can we give you a license and verification and give you a chance at this if it's going to be more expensive in the long run for the community. So, any questions?
From your point of view, is there any compelling reason why every ambulance needs to be staffed by 2 ALS paramedics as opposed to an IV tech and an ALS paramedic?
Well, first of all, there's no compelling reason that the answer is no in the right circumstances. It sort of depends on what your mix of, you know, who else how many people you have at the scene. For example, and I'll by way of making an illustration, in EMS District 2, AMR, and for all of Clark County is required to be staffed, an ALS ambulance, with at least 1 paramedic and at least an IV tech. In most of EMS District 2, AMR arrives at the scene and they have a fire ALS rig there as well with 1 or 2 paramedics on that particular fire apparatus, or 2 apparatus that has a paramedic in each. So at the scene of a complicated medical or trauma problem, they have usually 2 at the minimum paramedics available to work that patient, and the fire paramedic usually rides in with the AMR rig as it comes to the hospital. Now, there is an advantage if you can afford it. There is a difference in cost between the IV tech and the paramedic, but there's an advantage if you can afford it if you can get that, you know, to have 2 paramedics where you're gonna have 2 paramedics at the scene of a major crunch.
But is there any reason that you need to use a paramedic as a driver?
No, there was no reason. It's a staff.
So if you were dispatching an engine that was adequately staffed, then there's no compelling reason to use 2 ALS paramedics, 1 as a driver.
And it is, you know, I have to be honest, it is not required in the county. We do not have a requirement that it is staffed that way. That's a choice. Now, there are some, I'll be honest and say there are some of the fire rigs in for Vancouver Fire have 2 paramedics on them.
And then another question is, I understand the limitation on transport licenses. Is there a similar limitation on aid?
There are min-max numbers of aid services, BLS aid services, but we haven't exceeded them.
My basic question is it consistent with the rules as you understand them at this point, that Washougal become an ALS aid provider that uses AMR for transport?
Well, can't. That can't happen.
Why not?
We've already looked at that before. It came up a couple of years ago.
I remember, I was
and,
here.
and AMR cannot get into their, they can't violate their contract by, with EMS District 2, which basically, because they can't service Washougal as an island outside of, and use their existing system status deployment in the state, in the county. Because it would also, which means that they can't service it, they couldn't get there in the appropriate amount of time, and they'd have to put a vehicle there 24/7, 365, and that proved to be economically untenable for AMR. So unless Washougal is willing to subsidize them for a huge amount of money, that probably wouldn't do that. And I'm not sure that right now, when AMR and AMR is not doing it, but the EMS District 2 and Vancouver Fire are in the midst of producing an RFP for the next, the ambulance contract runs out, give or take, December of 2014. I don't think they're very excited about looking for ways to upset EMS District 2 and the rest.
I'm not really all that, I don't have in my head the district maps all that well. But does East County Fire and Rescue border on District 2?
EMS, yes. No, they don't, because we have Camas and Washougal in between.
What's north of Camas?
North of us.
North, they touch on part of EMS District 2.
Right, in the rural.
So they are actually, if East County Fire and Rescue were included, they would actually be contiguous.
I'm not sure there's an easy way in, though. I think we'd have to sit at the map and look at that. That's not ever been brought up as a question. I guess the issues are that I don't think you'll find much interest with AMR, because they didn't have any. They said it wasn't economically reasonable 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and let me tell you, their economics hasn't improved.
My memory of the conversations with AMR is a little different than that, but that's okay.
I could probably offer, just very, very recently, I had a brief chat with Doug Smithley. I always want to make sure I get his last name in the right order. Asking him about that because of the doctor's advice to us a couple of years ago, or almost a couple of years ago, when we were exploring that option on behalf of the council, and were told that it was not a viable option.
Yeah, it was 4 years ago.
I wanted to talk to Doug again to make sure I understood at some detailed level, like this flow chart here, for example, about that process. And what he explained to me, and this was Doug off the top of his head in a phone conversation, and in no way is he making any commitments of any kind for EMS2 and its governing body. And they are in the midst of a procurement process, or getting ready for a procurement process. But we could enter into an arrangement with EMS2 / whomever their service provider is. Could be AMR. But EMS2 and that service provider would have to be able to work within the parameters of the system that they have deployed, and a system that has gotten the approval of this regulatory scheme that we've been informed about this evening. One of the guiding principles that they have is serving a contiguous service area. Service levels are equal everywhere so that the billing rates are the same and all of that. And we discussed this notion of an island or it's not an island, and we talked about the rural boundary and the topography. If Eckford and Washougal somehow were, two came around and wrapped around, and then Camas was there. He couldn't make a commitment either way, of course, and I really, it's very, very important for me to say that, because I didn't tell Doug that I was going to be talking about this at this meeting, but he had some concern that that would be a significant issue in terms of any efficacy for that type of a model, notwithstanding the economics and notwithstanding the timing of their procurement process, that the basic system parameters could not be served in that regard. On the other hand, if there was complete contiguity with all of that, that would be a different animal. We did not get into that conversation because that's not a conversation that is currently ongoing. So, you know, as your staff, at the end of the day, and looking at these at these options and these alternatives, because the council wanted to understand them, you know, we reached a conclusion. We did the financial analysis. The differences are not huge in terms of the costs. However, there's some level of service issues, and there's just a real, very daunting pragmatic reality about the efficacy of us either going it alone or doing some other alternative that I would not advise, you know, undertaking energy along and expending energy in pursuing those types of options, and really believe that there's two options that are in front of us that involve our three-way EMS agreement, continuing to work with our partners. We're coming up to the end of our time here.
Yeah, I was going to say, do we have council members, any other council members have questions for Dr. Whitworth? We certainly keep continuing this discussion as we get into the other meeting, but I think we need to be time sensitive for your time.
Thank you. So we can, we have some more information to share. I had talked to the mayor that we weren't sure if we fit this in, and before the last items on the agenda, we can come back and pick up where we left off.
Yeah, I do have a number of other questions, none more for Dr. Whitworth.
Okay, with that, we're going to suspend this this discussion at the moment. I'll take a couple quick moments. If there are any folks in the audience that would like to comment to council before we break this session, we will be coming back in at 7 o'clock with our regular meeting. There is an opportunity at the start of that meeting for public comment as well. But anybody that can't stick around, that is just dying to make comment? Okay, seeing none, we will adjourn for the moment, and we will be back here at 7 o'clock for our regular council meeting.